Better late than never. I'm so excited about this evening tonight. Um, First, a couple things. This is our civility lecture series. It's hybrid tonight, so we will be taking questions from our Zoom audience as well as from in here. This program is brought to you by the Dylan Schneider Group, Hearst Media, and the Ferguson Library. We've been doing this since 2011, so we're very excited about tonight's program. Because we have a couple of exciting things coming up, if you have grandchildren or children and you are interested in getting them excited about reading, June 8th is Daryl McDaniel of Run DMC. He's going to be here. We'll be giving out 100 copies of his children's book. Very, very exciting. July 13th, the Friends Author Series is back in person. David Baldacci will be here. This will not be recorded. This will not be hybrid, and it will be a fundraiser. So make sure you register early. And then June 9th, we have a very special program. It's the Joe R. Sexton Lecture. It's going to be held in this room, and it's going to, Susan's here, she can correct me, but it's going to be about Admiral Rickover, and it's going to be a great evening. But tonight, we are so excited. We are happy to welcome our special guest interview host tonight, and I'm going to read his information, even though he is not here. Ernie Anestas is a New York TV news legend, celebrating several decades as a top anchor. He has won more than 30 Emmy Awards and nominations and the Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence in Journalism. Ernie is also the author of 2 children's books. He will soon host Positively America, a new TV show featuring positive news stories and interviews. The program is designed to improve lives and show that optimism and hope are paving the way to an even better tomorrow. He also is a former civility speaker here in our first year. Ernie had the task of introducing John Bolton, so I'm going to try to take it over. And I'm doing this at the same time I'm trying to enlarge the font on my phone. John Bolton is an American attorney, diplomat, Republican consultant, and political commentator. He served as the 25th United States Ambassador to the United Nations from 2005 to 2006, and as the 26th United States National Security Advisor from 2018 to 2019. And it is my pleasure to introduce him. It is a great honor to have him here. I guess your choice. Okay. And maybe when we can start here when Ernie comes.
Okay. We're just debating where I should stand while they want me to go up there. Okay. It is more in the middle. That's true. So I feel like Clint Eastwood at the Republican National Convention, but I want to apologize. I left New York with my Secret Service protective detail at 4 o'clock. And we thought we'd get here in about an hour and 15 minutes, or at least that's what Google told us. So didn't work out that way. But my apologies and thank you very much for sticking around. I think maybe what I should do is start off by talking about Ukraine, since I think that's probably what many of the questions would be about. And I'd have to say to me, represents a real American failure that we're having this conflict at all. President Biden said on several occasions that he didn't think deterrence would work against Russia. And yet, for months, really, before the invasion, he threatened economic sanctions. He threatened a number of other steps that we would take, which he said later were intended really only as punishment. And if Russia did invade, which I found difficult to understand. I mean, I think any conduct is deterrable if you put the right steps together. And it's really kind of a dereliction of duty. Faced with the evidence that we had, we all saw pictures of the Russian troop buildup. and if there was not really an effort to deter the attack, then I think there's a lot of explaining to do, because it's not enough to say, well, it's true that Russia has invaded Ukraine, but we've imposed really stiff sanctions on Moscow. That shouldn't leave us happy that a bad thing has happened, so we've done something in return. The objective should have been to prevent the conflict from taking place, which we failed to do. And the consequences of that, sadly, continue to be visited on the Ukrainian people. And it's a bad lesson for the Russians to learn, for China to learn, for many other people around the world to learn, that the United States, the leader of the Western alliance, simply didn't even try very hard to prevent the conflict from taking place. Now, it's true that Biden started with a weak hand, weak for several reasons. Our credibility in terms of the sanctions that Biden proposed was very weak. Putin had ordered the invasion of Georgia in August of 2008. The Western response was very weak. A few sanctions, but essentially the Russians were able to invade Georgia and hive off 2 provinces. In 2014, Putin orchestrated an annexation of Crimea and basically invaded eastern Ukraine and also carved off pieces of 2 provinces. And the Western response again was lackluster. Some additional sanctions, but basically Putin got away with that invasion. And then in the summer of 2021, we saw the American and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I believe was a catastrophic strategic mistake. It was carried out in a just a humiliating fashion, but the basic strategic decision to withdraw was a mistake. But in Putin's mind, and in the mind of Xi Jinping in China, it opened for them huge opportunities. And I'm afraid we're going to see that play out in the future as well. So what the Russians saw was failure to act in the case of Georgia, failure to act in the case of Ukraine, and withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think Putin calculated he would get away with it, which due to the heroism of the Ukrainian forces and very substantial Western assistance, they have not achieved the fullest objectives that they sought. Although the war is being fought on Ukrainian territory, and the devastation that we're seeing will take years to fix. So we're in a very unclear period at the moment. The Russians are ahead in certain terms, behind in other terms, but this could grind on for really months or years. Maybe what I'll do is stop there and ask for questions from you about Ukraine, because I could go on for another hour on that, and I don't want to miss covering a few other subjects if anybody wants to stick around. So I'll just conclude that part by saying I'm disappointed in the efforts of the United States with respect to Ukraine, and I'm not optimistic about the near-term prospects for changing.
If we have questions, you have to speak into the mic, or else the Zoom people won't hear.
Okay.
You mentioned how disappointed you are with the administration and the country's response. What would President Bolton have done?
Well, in the first place, if people had listened to George W. Bush in April of 2008, he proposed bringing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO on a fast-track basis, and the French and the Germans said no. it is a fact that in 70 plus years now of NATO's history, neither the Soviet Union nor Russia have ever crossed a NATO border. So, today Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are thanking their lucky stars that they got in before the Russians decided to attack them. And after decades of neutrality, Finland and Sweden have applied because they understand that their only real guarantee is to be a NATO member. So, this mistake was made many, many years ago, but to correct it, what should have been done in advance was begin to send military assistance at much higher levels to Ukraine much earlier. Number one. Number two, we should have put more American and other NATO forces on the ground in Ukraine, not to fight, but to train Ukrainians in the weapons that we'd be sending them. And let the Russian generals looking through their field glasses across the border and seeing the American flag say to themselves, I wonder what that means. Third, I would not have said, as Biden did in December, that Americans wouldn't fight. I'd leave it ambiguous, and I'd put the burden of the ambiguity on the Russians. Could Biden have done something else? Yes, he could have said nothing. Let Putin worry about that. He could have said all options are on the table. Let Putin worry about that. I think we could have imposed sanctions before the war. And you say, well, on what basis? Because the Russians had committed unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in 2014. So late, 8 years late, but better late than never, to show to Putin it's going to be worse this time. In other words, to try and regain some lost credibility, which we didn't do. Now, there's no guarantee that even those steps would have succeeded to reestablish the broken structures of deterrence. And you may recall when, here's our moderator. I'm doing both jobs. Maybe you can do both jobs now, but people said you can't impose sanctions. I was almost as late as you were, so don't feel bad.
All right, we apologize. I'm sorry, continue.
People said you can't impose sanctions before the Russians actually cross the Ukrainian border because it will provoke them. Well, as opposed to what? They did cross the Ukrainian border, and they're carrying out this devastating war that's probably killed as many civilians as it has military personnel on both sides. So, there are a lot of excuses why we couldn't do this and we couldn't do that and we couldn't do the other thing. The 20th century is filled with excuses of people who didn't do enough in advance to stop a conflict that became worse. And to me, what this shows about Ukraine is something that one of my favorite Winston Churchill quotes that nobody's apparently heard, where he talked about the confirmed unteachability of mankind, where you're told again and again, if you just take this step early, you can prevent a broader conflict, and we never do it. And we didn't do it in Ukraine, and we've got what we've got today.
Mr. Ambassador, first of all, I apologize to all of you, and I know we had a tough ride coming in, but we're here, and we're delighted that you're here. This is
So am I, believe me.
This is an extraordinary man. I know you heard about his many accomplishments, and he's just terrific. We can talk about some of those things, but we want to hear. We started talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was something in the Washington Examiner, an op-ed piece, and you were talking about that, and you kind of referred to Biden and the situation as maybe we're looking at another Afghanistan. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that and perhaps why the Russians have performed so poorly. And with your experience, what can we learn from that?
Well, I think it's certainly true that the Russians did not live up to the expectations they had based on 20 years of effort to improve the Russian military. what it says to me about where they failed is that it must be the case that corruption is still deeply rooted in the Russian military at all levels of command. So if you're a battalion commander and you're supposed to have 500 men in your unit and you've only got 300, you're probably drawing salaries for 500, rations for 500, equipment for 500, selling that on the black market. You're probably doing okay, and your commander probably takes 10% of that, and so on and so on. So when somebody says, okay, move your battalion to the Ukrainian border, and you've got to find 200 additional people,
Sure.
that is not a good sign. But not only did the Russians fail to perform, but our intelligence failed as well. We saw the buildup of the Russian capability, but our intelligence officials and military were briefing the full Senate and full House in the early days after February 24th,
Sure.
saying Kiev will fall within a few days and the whole country will fall within a few weeks. And we were just as wrong as Putin was. So this is, to me, a pretty serious problem with U.S. intelligence, and it also reflected the view, at least some people had, that the Afghan government would hold out against Taliban for a considerable period of time, which it obviously did not. That was, in part, a failure of intelligence, also a failure at the political level of our government. But when you keep getting things wrong, you have to say what are the problems we need to fix, because if we can get it wrong in Ukraine, we can get it wrong somewhere else.
When this comes to an end, and I'm not sure when that will happen, how long do you think it'll be before we see some resolution?
Well, I was saying before, I think this conflict could go on certainly months and perhaps longer than that. I don't think Putin will have any incentive to negotiate seriously until he achieves something that he can say with a straight face is a military success, which he doesn't have yet. Now, Zelensky effectively conceded earlier this morning that Russia now controlled 20% of the territory of Ukraine. So I didn't look at the map and figure out. I think they've roughly doubled what they held on February 24th, maybe a little bit more than that. And current news reports indicate that the Russians are moving ahead more successfully than they have in other stages of the conflict. So it could be we're getting close to a point where Putin can say he's satisfied. He won't be, but he will get to a point where he thinks he can say it. On the other hand, it may be when he finally sees advances being made at a sufficiently rapid rate, he's going to say, let's keep going. Now, on the other side, Zelensky has no incentive to negotiate at this point either. And I'm not sure his government would long survive if he did, which is not to say that there's not an awful lot of people saying, let's bring this thing to a halt, which include at the moment the New York Times editorial board, no surprise there, Henry Kissinger, which did surprise me, a few dozen isolationists within the Republican Party in Congress, unfortunately, the president of France, newly re-elected Emmanuel Macron, that didn't surprise me either, and various others in Europe. So you can see the pressure is building on Zelensky, but I don't see the circumstances yet where negotiations occur.
Mr. Ambassador, we're also thinking, what happens when this does come to an end? Far-reaching issues that are affecting all of us, the whole world. What predictions do you have? I know it's hard to do that, but what impact will it have worldwide?
Well, I think first you have to judge what your objectives are, and then people can judge whether you've achieved the objectives or not. And I think ultimately it is up to Zelensky. But that's a way of passing the buck and saying I'm not going to worry about that. Let them worry about it. But to ask what should America's objectives be? Our position on February the 23rd was that Ukraine was entitled to full sovereignty and territorial integrity over its boundaries as of December 31, 1991, which is the date the Soviet Union broke up. Ukraine didn't have sovereignty over Crimea or part of the Donbass, and now it has less. So how can you say that there's anything like a victory if you don't at least get back to February 23rd? And honestly, if we're going to be if we're going to look ourselves in the mirror to say we failed in 2014. And if our guarantee, if the position of the United States means anything to anybody else anywhere around the world, here's looking at you, Xi Jinping in Beijing, you've got to carry through on what you say, what you commit to. I don't expect that to happen because I don't think the Biden administration wants to say what its objectives are. It certainly has done a pretty good job of not saying them so far. The president's op-ed in the New York Times a few days ago was a list of what he will do and what he won't do. That's not a strategy, and it's certainly not a statement of objectives.
President Biden has accused, as we know, Putin of genocide, talking about charging him with war crimes. Where could that go? What do you think about that possibility? And what would be the result of something like that?
This is a classic case of virtue signaling, to say, I just find this terrible. Well, that's great. You know, how about all the dead people? What does that do for them? It doesn't do anything for them. I mean, I think the idea that somebody commits unprovoked aggression and the response is to file a criminal indictment against them. I mean, really, what kind that you think that's deterrence? The Ukraine government has actually done a very good job of launching its own war crimes investigations. And if there's going to be any war crimes trials that really mean anything, it will be conducted by the Ukrainian government, not by the International Criminal Court. Ultimately, to bring the Russian leadership to account, you're going to need a change in government in Russia. And I know some people think this is my favorite subject, regime change in yet another country. But, you know, if you have an international court find Putin guilty of genocide, you'll make him a hero in Russia. These atrocities were committed in the name of Russia, and the Russian people at some stage to achieve real political maturity have to take on that responsibility themselves.
Talk to us a little bit about NATO, which has really pretty much come alive with this invasion. Is this thing for real, or is it something that we're seeing that the Europeans are going through a phase, and when it's over, there will be a lack of interest?
Well, I think there are different reactions in different countries. I mentioned a few minutes ago that Finland and Sweden resolving to join was a major change, and something I've talked to the Finns about in particular for 30 years. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, Finland was on the Security Council as a non-permanent member. And the Security Council authorized the use of force to expel the Iraqis from Kuwait, the first authorization of the use of force by the Security Council since Korea in 1950. And Finland went through a great internal debate. It was a neutral country that prized themselves and voted to authorize the use of force. And then later, George H.W. Bush got Congress to authorize it. So we used to joke, we got Finland to vote in favor of force against Saddam Hussein before Congress. But it was part of that just showed how deeply rooted this neutrality was. So for Finland to switch, I'd urge you to look at a map and now see what the new NATO border with Russia looks like. And something Putin certainly never contemplated. That's a major step forward, and I welcome it because it's the Finns in particular, a very hard-headed country, and they know exactly what they're doing. It's not something they did on the spur of the moment, because they have been thinking about it for a long time. I do think within NATO itself, there's more of an appearance of unity and renewed strength than I'm afraid there is. In fact, it remains to be seen how strong the new apparent German commitment will be. You know, Chancellor Scholz promised to spend 100 million euros on billion euros, sorry, 100 billion euros on new weapons. Which is an important thing for them to do, because German planes don't fly, their ships don't steam, and their tanks don't roll. Sure. So just replacing all of this rusting, aging equipment will take more than 100 billion euros. And it's not entirely clear they're really committed to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense, as they committed to do with everybody else in NATO in 2014. I hope people have woken up. People in Central and Eastern Europe have woken up. The Western Europeans are a little bit more problematic.
As the expression goes, there are a lot of moving parts here. I hope you're enjoying this. Are you having fun watching and listening? I am. I'm enjoying this immensely. A lot of great information.
I try and spread sweetness and light wherever I go.
Speaking of that, in the review of Mike Esper's book, 16 Months as Defense Secretary under Donald Trump, and you wrote, and we quote, "Mr. Trump should never again be president." You hammered that point in your own book, The Room Where It Happened. Still, it's nice to hear it from the source. And you can say something, you can read it, but we have them here. And I want to ask you about your conclusion, in terms of someone who was there, you were in the room, you were part of this. You make that comment, Mr. Trump should never again be president. Tell us about that.
Well, I don't think he's fit to be president, which is a pretty good place to start. And one reason I wrote the book was to show that I was wrong when I believed when I joined the government that nobody calls me naive, at least very rarely. I had heard everything people had said about Trump. I'd met him myself several times, but I believed very strongly that, like every other American president, certainly in the national security space, the weight of the responsibilities, the gravity of the decisions he had to make would weigh on him. And it would produce a kind of discipline that you have to have when you make important decisions about national security. But I found out that I was wrong, that it didn't impose any discipline on him at all. He doesn't think in policy terms. He makes a lot of decisions, which I certainly agreed with. I could go down a long list of them. But I described these decisions, agree or disagree, as an archipelago of dots. That here's one decision, and there's another decision, and there's another decision. You can try and draw lines between those dots, but he doesn't. And ultimately, you can't run national security policy on that kind of basis. He saw everything through the prism of whether or not it benefited Donald Trump. Look, every president takes politics into account. That's how they got there. He's the only one I'm aware of that took only politics into account. And I felt in the potential second term that, freed from any kind of electoral constraint, there was no telling what he would do. Some people say, well, you've got a personality conflict with him, which is probably true. But I also described trying to work inside the Trump administration is like living inside a pinball machine, which is the only metaphor I can think of. It's not that's not a personality conflict. That's a basic problem of how you address very serious issues in a serious way.
I want to ask you a few questions because a lot of people are definitely interested. Donald Trump is a huge figure, and people are paying attention to him. They're watching him. There's talk about him running again. And I want to know what you think his chances are of being reelected. And why is there this fascination? I mean, I've known Donald Trump for years, too, covering the news in New York. I interviewed him many times and we've spent time together. But tell me from your perspective, you were there, you had an opportunity to leave if you wanted to. In fact, some people criticized you and said, you know what, you write a book, you were there, you could have said, hey, I don't want to be part of this. So maybe a couple of questions there. Why did you stay? Does he have another opportunity? And why are people so fascinated talking about and following Donald Trump?
Yeah, actually, I'm kind of tired of it, but you asked the question, so I'll give you the answer. It's certainly the case. I've been criticized for not leaving earlier and not going public and not appearing in TV or not testifying or this or that or the other. I've also been criticized by people, including good friends of mine, who said, "Who do you think you are resigning? You got a president that you obviously think is not capable of doing the job. You could have helped him. Why did you abandon the burning ship when you should have stayed right till the bitter end?" So all I can say is it's easier if you're not there. I think a lot of people went through many of the same considerations that I did, and what my conclusion was, although I don't purport to say I arrived at it through systematic thought, was I stayed as long as I could. And then
Did you think there was a chance that he would change? Were you hoping that maybe something would be different?
not after a while.
No.
No, I mean, it's pretty clear that's the way he was. And
Mhm.
it was my misjudgment that the weight of the office would have changed him.
Has he changed at all since?
I don't think so. I think it's gotten worse. But let me ask why.
Okay.
Let me answer the
Okay.
question why I wrote
Okay.
the book. You know, when somebody goes public and holds a dramatic press conference and says that guy's an idiot, you know, you get on all the news programs for a couple days, and then you're shuffled off to the footnotes of history. What I did was I wrote a 500-page book and published it 5 months before the 2020 election. I told the whole story the way I wanted to tell it, without a lot of hot dogging by members of Congress, Democrat or Republican, in the impeachment effort.
Mhm.
You know, did it have an effect on the election? I don't know, but I wrote it for history as well. And as to follow the Frank Sinatra doctrine, I did it my way. And you know, I don't have any regrets. You also asked, and I do think this is important, whether Trump can be renominated.
Mhm.
And my personal view, which I think is a minority view, but is based on 17 months of very close personal observation, is I don't think he's going to run. And I say that because I believe that he thinks he did lose the 2020 election. He will never say that, obviously, but I think he understands that he did, and he fears that he would lose the 2024 election. In all the things he hates most of all being called a loser, and he doesn't want to be a loser in history. So I think what that means is that he will talk incessantly about running right up until the very last moment, find some pretext why he won't run, and then he will try and be a kingmaker within the Republican nomination process, which he may well be successful at. I also think there's whatever he thinks about it, there's a dynamic that's already underway within the Republican Party of a dozen or more people who are seriously looking at running. And I've actually changed my analysis on this in the past couple of days, and I'm still testing this out. But I think now, of this dozen or more people, they are not holding back in their campaign efforts or pre-campaign efforts or testing the waters or whatever you want to call it, because they see that others, some have already made a decision to run. They haven't said that publicly, but their behavior is very clear that whether Trump runs or not, they're going to run. And all the others who might have been content to wait to hear what Trump has to say now recognize that if they hold back, they're constraining their campaigns in a way they may never recover from. So I think now that dozen people, plus or minus, they're now running as if he's not going to run. If he announces later he is running, they'll have to reconsider. But if they slow themselves down now, they may not recover from it. So that in and of itself makes it harder for Trump to run again and risk losing. His record of endorsements in the primaries, where there's actually a contest as opposed to some guy running for dog catcher who's unopposed that he endorses, is mixed.
Let me ask you a couple of questions. I know we want to talk about China and Iran. We have these questions and I want to get to them, but I think this is something that everybody's interested in. I know I am. The divisiveness in our country is amazing. No matter where you go, you watch the news, or a lot of people don't watch the news, but if you do, you know, you see how we have been torn apart in this country in so many ways on so many different issues. And I want to ask you, with your experience, your expertise, having a pulse of what's going on, that's a serious problem, I believe, and I think you'll agree. Why is it like this? And is it going to get better? What can we do about it? Because everybody is really torn apart and frustrated by what we have.
Well, I think the level of partisanship is very high, and it's destructive. But I don't think it's unprecedented in our history. And there are different reasons for it. People can point to social media certainly would be part of it. But I think it's I wouldn't ascribe significant political changes just to technology. I think we're going through a period where the divisions have become clearer between the parties, even geographically. There's more separation. but I don't necessarily think the trend continues inevitably downhill. We've had significant divisions in the country before and have overcome them. We had a civil war. We've had periods when political rhetoric was very divisive and intense. The Democrats, for example, used to talk about a perennial Republican presidential wannabe in the late 19th century, James G. Blaine.
Sure.
And their slogan was Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine. That's pretty tough.
Yeah.
When Grover Cleveland ran for his second term, there's a great picture. It's one of those black and white silhouette pictures. The picture of the White House in the background and the fence and whatnot. In front of it's a lady with a baby carriage and a little boy.
Mm-hmm.
And the caption of the picture is the little boy saying, and this is a reference to Grover Cleveland, the little boy saying, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" And the lady says, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." That's in the 1880s,
Amazing.
1890s.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's pretty tough for those days.
Mm.
But in other words, it's we tend to look at our own era
That's true.
and see more divisiveness than historically was the case. But I don't necessarily agree with it. I'm not saying we're in a great time. I
Right.
just don't think it's inevitable it gets worse.
Okay, well, we're hoping things will get better. I mentioned China. You know, we have China's president more authoritarian right now. We want to talk about Iran. Biden's hoping to revive the nuclear deal with Iran, which could create some problems, lifting sanctions and so forth. How do you view those two issues?
Well, on Iran, I think the 2015 deal was a big mistake for the United States. I think over the past year, the administration's made even more concessions to the Iranians, making a bad deal even worse.
Yep.
There is zero evidence that Iran has made a strategic decision to give up the pursuit of nuclear weapons. People have done that. Muammar Gaddafi did it in 2003. And by the way, those who say, well, but the Libya model means he gets, a leader who does that gets assassinated 8 years later. I just ask all of you to think, did anybody in 2003 ever think there would be an Arab Spring? And the answer to that is no. So what happens 8 years later isn't caused by the decision to give up nuclear weapons. The deal was bad at the beginning because it gave Iran the right to enrich uranium. And it's true, the deal said only up to reactor grade levels. So a little physics from a lawyer here, reactor grade levels are 3 to 5% of the U-235 isotope, which naturally occurring is 0.7% of uranium. Weapons grade uranium is 90% U-235 or more. That sounds like a long way away, right? It's not.
Yeah.
When you enrich uranium through the centrifuge method, which is what Iran uses, and you enrich from the natural concentration of U-235 to reactor grade concentrations, you have done 70% of the work, 70% of the work to get to weapons grade concentrations. So a peaceful civil nuclear program gets you 70% of the way there. Now, when America licenses nuclear technology for civil reactors around the world, we insist that the licensee pledge not to do any uranium enrichment or plutonium reprocessing. So reactors we've licensed in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and elsewhere all contain that prohibition. Our friends in the Arab world say, we can't enrich, and you allowed the Iranians to enrich. So the deal itself was bad. I could go on for hours on this subject, and the Iranians have been violating it in any case. So to go back into it would be a huge mistake. The United States is the only country that can stop nuclear proliferation. If you don't mind Iran having nuclear weapons, if you don't mind North Korea having nuclear weapons, and then, by the way, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and everybody else who are going to say, I'm not going to sit here and let that guy have nuclear weapons and not get them myself. That's what proliferation is all about. If you don't stop the initial threat, you're simply going to find yourself in a more dangerous, more nuclear proliferant world. On China, I think the American people are coming to realize that for about close to 40 years, our China policy has been misguided. They're seeing evidence of that. brought to public attention by the coronavirus outbreak, which exposed a lot of other Chinese behavior. But our policy for really since the mid 1980s has been based on two assumptions that have been proven false. The cause of all this is Deng Xiaoping in the mid 1980s, essentially abandoning Marxist economic principles and adopting some kind of state capitalist principles, which nobody should be surprised resulted in an enormous increase in national wealth for China. And people in America and elsewhere believe that great increase in national wealth would have two principal consequences. One, it would make China behave better in international affairs. It would join the World Trade Organization. It would conform to the norms of the industrial democracies around the world, and they'd be good citizens. My good friend Bob Zoellick, who I worked with in the Bush 41 administration, he went on to be president of the World Bank, made a famous speech where he said, China is engaged in a peaceful rise, and it will be a responsible stakeholder in world affairs. And they haven't been. The Chinese have twisted the WTO. They've taken what should be a free trade organization and used it for mercantilist principles. They steal our intellectual property in ways that give them competitive advantage around the world. If you don't have to do R&D, if you can just steal what your competitors are doing, it's a huge leg up. They've made it a way of life. They routinely discriminate against foreign investors and traders, except for those that they favor for their own reasons. They have not become responsible stakeholders. They are not engaged in a peaceful rise. The second kind of foundational principle that we based our policy on was that this increase in China's national wealth would also lead to an increase in democratization. I can give you by memory the argument that, you know, there was an election in village X out in the middle of province Y for the village headman. It was competitive. And that's going to spread. And the next village will hold a democratic election, the next village, and then it'll spread to the provincial level, and then it'll spread to the national level. Greater wealth will bring greater democracy. 180 degrees wrong. Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. He certainly faces a number of challenges now, but by all accounts, at the next party Congress, he'll in effect be declared leader for life. His thought will go up there along with Mao Zedong thought. So in China, it will be Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Xiism. This is not an increase in democracy by anybody's imagination. So it seems to me when the two fundamental premises of your policy have been proven wrong, maybe it would be time to get a different policy. China is a threat across the economic, political, military spectrum in so many ways. I just give you one example that we have come too late. Europeans aren't quite where we are, but fortunately, the Australians and New Zealanders saw it first. China has companies that are not really commercial companies. They're instruments of the State Intelligence Service, and two of their names are Huawei and ZTE, that are trying to dominate fifth generation telecommunications, and not just through hardware, but through software. So once you understand that, a lot of what Huawei and ZTE do around the world becomes more understandable. You know, it's what an assistance to Chinese intelligence if they don't have to have people hack into telecommunication systems, if they own the telecommunication system. And what the Chinese have done over the years in that regard already is incredible. We talked for a long time about Russian efforts to interfere in our elections, which were true. But Gina Haspel, who was director of the CIA when I was in the government, said she'd never seen efforts at espionage and influence in her time in the government comparable to what the Russians, what the Chinese were doing, far more than the Russians. And I'll just give you an example. This is everything I've said public, but some years ago, China hijacked out of our computer system all of the records held by the Office of Personnel Management in Washington, the personnel records of federal employees. Now, maybe your first reaction is to say, how boring is that? Well, It includes, for example, in my case, I can't even count the number of FBI background investigations that I've gone through. So they've got all of that stuff that all my neighbors and everybody else have ever said about me. Now, fortunately, I've led a boring life. So they don't have anything on me particularly, but they've got that for a lot of other
Oh,
people.
sure.
And their ability to do that and their willingness to do it and the failure of the United States for many years to do anything about it has encouraged them to be even bolder. So we've got a lot of catching up to do to deal with China. But I think we're alerted now, and I feel optimistic we will.
We're going to have a pop quiz when this is over. Are you ready for it? I know we got started a little late. It's almost 7:15. And Mr. Ambassador, some people may want to ask a question. Would you like to do that? Do you have a question for the ambassador? Anybody? Yes, go ahead, sir.
Wait, you need the microphone? I'm running over.
Okay, here you go. Alice, get to that microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Back to the Ukraine. In the future, do you see the possibility of a stabilized country, whether it's a whole Ukraine or a partial Ukraine, joining NATO?
Well, NATO has never admitted a member that has hostile troops on the territory of the applicant for the basic reason that you would be admitting a member that was already at war if you did that. So I don't see NATO membership in the near term. Now, some people have said, look, we all know Ukraine's never going to be a NATO member anyway, at least in the foreseeable future. It's corrupt. It doesn't have a stable democracy. And I wouldn't say it's a model of Jeffersonian democracy, but when we let the Central and European countries in the 1990s, they weren't models of democracy either. They wanted in because they feared being reabsorbed into a Soviet space, and they wanted protection. So when George W. Bush proposed bringing Ukraine and Georgia in on a fast track, the French and the Germans didn't oppose it because they were corrupt or not sufficiently democratic. They didn't want them in because they worried about the consequences of unbalancing the European Union, really, in some respects. But the fact that it's entirely possible that Ukraine will be effectively partitioned in the near future, I think makes it very hard to see. You need unanimity to get NATO membership. I mean, that's the only bump in the road for Finland and Sweden because Turkey has objected. That'll be overcome. But I don't see the formula of how to do that, which is unfortunate because it is a fact that NATO is a defensive alliance, and neither the Soviets nor anybody other than Al Qaeda have ever crossed the NATO border.
Anyone else? Okay, yes.
Sorry to go back to the Trump administration, but when do you think the Republican Party will be able to release the shackles that Trump has on them so tightly, the leadership and on local levels, federal level?
Well, I don't think it's in such a tight Trump grasp. I've done polling that shows among Republican voters and independents who vote in Republican primaries a steady decline in Trump's influence. It's not down to zero. It's not where I'd like it to see. It's not going down as fast as I like, but it is going down, and people shouldn't be surprised at that. I think the one aspect that has a more lasting impact, but it may on the Democratic Party too, is when you ask Trump voters what they particularly like about him, the answer across a broad variety of polls is he fights for us. And you say, okay, well, what does he fight for you? And they say he fights for us. And what that shows is real disaffection from the political process. And that's not a good thing under any circumstance. I'm not excusing anything. I'm just telling you, these are people who say nobody listens to me. In 2016, there was a substantial number of people who voted for Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries and then voted for Donald Trump in the general election. Say, how can that possibly be? These are really disaffected people. And it's not the groups of disaffected who are normally characterized that way. It's a lot of blue collar people around the country, and they were attracted to Trump because he fights for them when normal politicians don't. And that loyalty is the hardest of all, I think, to break.
Anybody else? Yes, sir. We need the microphone over here, Alice.
Yep.
And another question over here. This is good. This is turning into a news conference. I like this.
And I won't
Okay.
need to work out.
There we go. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious who you would consider endorsing out of the dozen Republicans that you were talking about. Who would you put in the possible endorsement? Who would you put in the bottom of the heap that you would not consider?
Well, I think from my perspective, I obviously look at national security qualifications, but I also think the Republican Party's history of nominating successful governors has been an important factor. Unlike those parties that nominate senators who think their job is to talk about things, governors actually have to solve problems. So I like DeSantis, I like Cotton, although he's a senator. I like Ben Sass of Nebraska. I think we're going to have. I like Larry Hogan, my own governor in Maryland. I don't know what any of their prospects would be. You know, the people I would rule out would be the people who are unwilling to say in unequivocal terms that Trump didn't lose the election. I mean, if they can't bring themselves to say he lost, then I think that's a problem.
Okay, we have another question right back here. Okay, there you go, Alice. Sir.
China, in terms of Taiwan, attacking Taiwan, Iran, in terms of attacking Israel. What have are there any lessons those countries have learned already from what's going on in the Ukraine?
Well, I think China's watching Ukraine closer than anybody else, and I'm afraid the lessons aren't very good from our point of view. You know, for all the talk about the sanctions on Russia, they haven't been that effective. They have raised costs to Russia. That's fine, but there's a lot of hoopla about them. When the Europeans first put sanctions on, and most recently on oil, but when they put a number of sanctions on Russia, Britain, for example, announced it wasn't going to import oil 2 or 3 months ago, wasn't going to import any oil from Russia, not being in the EU anymore, effective December 31st of this year. Well, what kind of sanction is that? And I think the lesson China draws from the inability of the West to impose more effective sanctions is here they're dealing with a country that's a one-trick pony in terms of international economic strength. It's export of hydrocarbons, oil and gas, and they have trouble pressuring them. Given the interrelationships between China's economy and the West as a whole, you know, when we impose sanctions on a country, we bear costs too. We bear the cost of not being able to buy their products. I think China says we've got them by the neck because we'll be so reluctant to take strong steps against China, which is very bad news for Taiwan and everybody along their periphery. I'm very worried about that lesson.
As we wrap this up, another question. I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I think Israel teaches Iran lessons fairly regularly, including a drone into the facility at Parchin a couple of weeks ago. So I think that's one reason why Iran wants the U.S. back in this deal, because I think they believe that'll help put pressure on Israel not to do what they've been doing so successfully.
One of the standard questions, and I will ask this, that we usually ask as journalists at the end of an interview. Okay, what's next for John Bolton? Another political position, another book? What do you have in store?
Well, I'm worried about the 2022 elections, and I have a PAC, a super PAC, a foundation. I've got one of everything that I've had for about 10 years to try and help get elected people who believe in a strong American foreign policy, a Reaganite kind of foreign policy. And so I'll be working on that for the next several months.
Okay. Was there one last question somewhere? Yes, I didn't want to ignore you.
As we develop foreign policy, how are we going to get a better balance between domestic and foreign policy? I think that's what's driving the blue collar revolt. We have the average citizen in this country is struggling, can't pay their rent, can't purchase food. And this has been a problem since the mid-'80s. It's not anything new.
Well, I think I'd have to say I may disagree with you on that because I think there is an imbalance between foreign policy and domestic policy. I think our politicians rarely talk about foreign policy, and I think that's a big problem. I mean, look, if you look at the last couple or three presidential elections and look at the time in the debate spent on foreign policy versus domestic policy compared to what a president actually does during the day, the disparity is incredible. And I think that's unfortunate because I think when the decisions that are entrusted to presidents in foreign and defense policy are the most serious that we can allocate, and we make these decisions, I don't think, on a very effective basis.
Okay, we don't want to ignore anyone. Was there another question somewhere? We're good? Okay, follow up. Oh, right here, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
I will be happy to do that.
Sign that book. Another person back there. That's great.
Thank you.
Selling books is a good thing, and
Thank-
signing
no,
them
no,
especially.
So it's for those on Zoom. She asked if she could have her book autographed.
There you go. Well, the answer was yes. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves. Yes. Yeah. You have a final follow-up?
Wait, again, but nobody on Zoom can hear the question, so
One
I'll have to get
second.
over here.
Hold on.
How do you, 25 years from now, how do you think history will view President Zelensky?
Well, if his history ends today, he will be viewed very, very positively. He will have to go through at some point the resolution of how this war is going to end. And we don't know what his performance will be there. And if he survives that politically, and then goes on to try and be president of a country that's been devastated by a war, that's another heavy test too. So I think the grade is incomplete at this point.
Okay, we're good. Ambassador, we thank you very much for being here. And we thank you for joining us, and sorry for the delay. I hope the ride back is going to be easier for both of us. But this was a lot of fun, very interesting, and I think we all learned something from this interview. And we certainly hope you'll come back, and we hope you'll come back as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. You know, we have a couple of things with Father Alex Carlutzis today
Oh, is that
with
right?
the Patriarchate.
Yeah.
And he said, you know what? He said, when you see John, tell him I said hello. He said, we introduced him to the Patriarch.
Yeah.
And John Catsimatidis is a very dear friend of mine.
Oh, is that right?
We've
Yeah, I was
known
just
each
with
other-
him today.
Oh, we've
Yeah.
known each other for years.
Oh, no kidding.
Oh, my God. Yep, I'm in the Greek community, but John and I have started together with so many different projects, 30 years.
No kidding.
I
That's
know the
great.
family very well. But it was a pleasure being with you.
No, thanks.